On board an airplane, a little black girl gathers up her courage and shouts, "That's not my father." What happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the park, its rays filtering through the branches of towering oak trees. Children's laughter echoed across the wide expanse, mingling with the rhythmic creak of swings and the sharp bark of a dog chasing a frisbee. Nia was in the middle of a game of tag, her braids bouncing as she darted between her friends. Her sneakers kicked up tiny clouds of dust as she laughed, her voice rising in carefree glee. The world felt safe and familiar, a sanctuary of routines she knew by heart. "Catch me if you can," she shouted, her grin wide and unrestrained as she dodged her friend Maya's outstretched hands. The game carried on, moving fluidly across the playground. Nia felt a sense of pride at being one of the fastest among her friends. She loved this park, the way it smelled of freshly cut grass and the faint trace of wood smoke from a distant barbecue. It was her haven, a place where her parents' reminders to be careful felt unnecessary. Everyone knew each other here, and the comforting presence of adults sitting on nearby benches or chatting at picnic tables added to the sense of security. It was during one of her victorious escapes that Nia noticed him. At first, he was just a figure standing at the edge of the park, leaning casually against a lamppost. His tall frame and pale skin stood out against the warm, earthy tones of the park. Something about the way he was watching her felt off. Nia slowed her pace slightly, her brow furrowing as she caught his gaze. He wasn't looking at the other children, just at her. "Tag, you're it." Maya's voice jolted her back to the game. Nia blinked, brushing off her unease as she turned to resume running. Maybe he was someone's dad. The thought reassured her, and she pushed the man from her mind. A few minutes later, however, he was closer. Nia felt her stomach tighten as she realized he was walking toward her. His stride was purposeful, his eyes fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. She stopped, instinctively taking a step back. "Hi there, sweetheart," the man said, his voice smooth but carrying an unfamiliar edge. "It's time to go. Let's get moving." Nia froze, confusion and alarm coursing through her. "What?" she managed to say, her voice wavering. She didn't recognize him. His face, his voice, none of it felt familiar. "I'm your dad, remember? Come on, your mom's waiting for us," he said, reaching for her hand. His tone was firm, almost commanding, as if he expected her to follow without question. "You're not my dad." Nia's voice was louder now, her words carrying a mix of defiance and fear. She glanced around, hoping someone might notice the exchange, but most of the adults were distracted, talking amongst themselves or watching their own children. The man's expression hardened, and he stepped closer. "Enough games, Nia," he said sharply, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "We're leaving, now." Panic surged through her. She wanted to run, to scream, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. How did he know her name? Why was no one noticing? I don't know you," she stammered, her voice cracking. The man crouched slightly, his pale blue eyes locking onto hers. "Listen to me," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent chills down her spine. "You don't have a choice here. You come with me quietly, or I'll make sure no one believes a word you say. Understand?" Tears welled in Nia's eyes, but she bit her lip to keep them from falling. Her instincts screamed at her to fight back, to yell for help, but the weight of his words held her in place. She didn't want to believe him, but a small, terrified part of her wondered if he was right. Would anyone believe her? She was just a kid, a black girl in a mostly white neighborhood. The thought made her chest ache. He grabbed her wrist, his grip firm and unyielding. "Let's go," he said, pulling her toward the park's exit. "Wait!" Nia cried, her voice breaking. She turned her head, searching desperately for someone, anyone, who might see what was happening. But the park seemed oblivious. As they neared the parking lot, Nia's resistance grew. She dug her heels into the ground, trying to pull away. "Let me go!" she shouted, but the man's grip only tightened. "You're embarrassing yourself," he hissed, glancing around to ensure no one was paying attention. "Be quiet, or I'll tell everyone you're acting out. They'll think you're just a brat throwing a tantrum." Nia's heart pounded as his words sank in. Her voice faltered, the fight draining from her limbs. She looked up at him, her fear reflected in his unyielding expression. He opened the door of a dark sedan and shoved her inside. The click of the automatic lock sent a wave of dread washing over her. As the car pulled out of the parking lot, Nia pressed her trembling hands against the cool glass of the window. The park disappeared from view, and, with it, the safety of everything she'd ever known. The world outside blurred as the car picked up speed. Nia's mind raced, her thoughts a tangled mess of panic and disbelief. Who was this man? What did he want? And most importantly, how could she escape? The car hummed softly as it sped down the main road, the familiar sights of Nia's neighborhood quickly giving way to unfamiliar streets. The man drove with one hand on the wheel, the other gripping his phone, tapping at the screen. Nia sat frozen in the passenger seat, her small hands balled into fists on her lap. Her heart pounded in her chest, a constant, deafening drumbeat. She glanced at the door handle, silently willing herself to reach for it, but the memory of the locks clicking into place stopped her. "You can stop thinking about it," the man said without looking at her. His voice was flat, almost bored, but there was an edge to it that made her shiver. "The doors are locked. You're not going anywhere." Nia's throat felt tight, but she forced herself to speak. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man let out a dry chuckle, finally turning his cold blue eyes toward her. "Because I can," he said simply, as if that answered everything. "And because no one's going to stop me. Especially not you." Nia pressed herself against the seat, her nails digging into the fabric of her jeans. "You're not my dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even look like him." "I don't have to look like him," the man replied, his tone sharpening. "All I need is for people to believe I am. And trust me, they will. A white man with a black daughter? No one's going to question it." The weight of his words hit Nia like a physical blow. He was counting on the very thing her parents had always warned her about, that people would see her differently, judge her differently because of her skin color. He was using it as a weapon against her, and it made her stomach churn. "You're lying," she said, trying to muster some courage. "Someone will notice. Someone will stop you." The man's grip on the steering wheel tightened, and for the first time his calm facade cracked. "Listen, kid," he snapped, his voice low and venomous. "You can make this easy, or you can make it hard. But either way, you're coming with me. So shut up and sit still." Tears stung Nia's eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't let him see her cry. Instead, she turned her attention to the world outside the window, searching for something, anything, that might give her a chance to escape. The car was leaving the city now, the buildings thinning out as they merged onto a highway. She spotted a rest stop sign up ahead and felt a flicker of hope. If he stopped there, maybe she could make a run for it, But just as the thought crossed her mind, the man reached over and grabbed her wrist. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his voice quieter but no less threatening. "Don't. It won't end well for you." Nia's breath hitched, her pulse racing. "Please," she whispered, "just let me go." The man's lips curled into a smirk. "You think begging's going to help? You think anyone's going to believe a little black girl over me? Face it, you've got no one." His words felt like shards of glass cutting into her. She thought of her parents, of the way her father always said, "Your voice matters, Nia. Never let anyone silence you." But sitting here, trapped in this car with this man, it was hard to believe it. The highway stretched on, the rest stop sign disappearing in the rearview mirror. Nia bit her lip, trying to keep her panic at bay. She had to think of something. She couldn't just sit here and wait for whatever he had planned. As the car sped along, she noticed a police cruiser parked on the side of the road. Her heart leapt, but the man seemed to sense her hope. He slowed down slightly, giving the cruiser a wide berth, and cast her a sidelong glance. "Don't even think about it," he warned. "One wrong move, and I'll make sure you regret it." Nia swallowed hard, the lump in her throat almost choking her. She turned her gaze back to the window, her mind racing. If she couldn't get help now, she'd have to wait. But for how long? And would it be too late by then? The car finally exited the highway, pulling into a busy airport terminal. The sight of so many people filled Nia with a mix of hope and dread. Maybe, just maybe, someone would notice her. But the man's grip on her arm tightened as he parked the car and stepped out. "Stay close," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And keep your mouth shut." Nia hesitated for a moment, her legs trembling as she slid out of the car. The cool breeze against her face was a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension in the car. She looked around, taking in the bustling crowd of travelers, the announcements echoing over the loudspeakers, the steady hum of suitcases rolling across the pavement. It was chaos, but it was also her chance. As they walked towards the terminal, Nia tried to catch the eye of anyone passing by. She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but the man's words echoed in her mind. "No one will believe you." Her heart sank as she realized how easily he blended in. To everyone else, he probably looked like a stressed-out parent traveling with his child. No one would suspect the truth. But Nia knew the truth, and she wasn't going to give up. Not yet. The sliding doors of the airport terminal hissed open, and a wave of noise hit Nia. The muffled chatter of travelers, the crackling announcements over the PA system, the hum of rolling suitcases against the polished floors. It was a chaotic orchestra of movement and sound, but for Nia, it was a thin thread of hope. She scanned the crowd, searching for someone who might notice her, someone who might see that she didn't belong with the man clutching her wrist. His grip tightened as they stepped inside, as if he could sense her growing desperation. "Don't even think about it," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You try anything, and I'll make sure you regret it." Nia swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her mind raced even faster. There were so many people here. Surely someone would see through him. Surely someone would notice the fear in her eyes. They approached the security checkpoint, where a uniformed officer stood at the entrance, checking boarding passes and IDs. Nia felt her pulse quicken. This was her chance. If she could just say something, maybe they would help her. The man leaned down slightly, his cold blue eyes locking onto hers. "You're going to smile and stay quiet," he said through gritted teeth. "You're my daughter. End of story." Her legs felt like jelly as they moved forward in line. When it was their turn, the officer gave them a polite but cursory glance. The man handed over their documents, his ID and a boarding pass with Nia's name on it. Nia's stomach churned. He'd thought of everything. The officer barely looked at her, his attention focused on the papers. "Everything looks good," he said, handing them back. "Have a safe flight." "Thank you," the man replied smoothly, tugging Nia along before she could even think to speak. She cast one last glance at the officer as they moved past the checkpoint, but he was already turning his attention to the next passenger. Nia's shoulders slumped as they entered the terminal. She'd missed her chance. The man must have noticed her defeated expression because he gave her a smug, sidelong glance. "See? Told you no one would care," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Now, stop making things harder for yourself." They walked past rows of shops and restaurants, the smells of coffee and baked goods wafting through the air. The man stopped briefly at a kiosk to buy a bottle of water, still keeping a firm hold on Nia's wrist. She stood silently by his side, her mind racing. She couldn't give up. Not yet. "Here," he said, handing her the bottle as they walked toward their gate. "Drink. You're going to need your strength." Nia stared at the bottle in her hands, her fingers tightening around the plastic. Every instinct told her to throw it, to scream, to run, but where? The terminal was crowded, the exits far behind them. And what if he was right? What if no one believed her? As they reached their gate, the man found 2 seats near the window. He sat down, pulling out his phone and tapping at the screen. Nia sat beside him, her small frame sinking into the oversized chair. The vast expanse of the airport stretched out beyond the window, planes taking off and landing in an endless rhythm. It felt like another world, one she couldn't reach. A woman with a clipboard approached the man, her smile professional but distracted. "Sir, just confirming your seats. You're traveling with your daughter?" "Yes, that's right," he replied without hesitation, his voice calm and confident. He placed a hand on Nia's shoulder, the gesture meant to look fatherly but feeling more like a shackle. "She's a little nervous. First time flying since her mother passed." The woman's expression softened. "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that," she said, glancing at Nia with a hint of pity. "Flying can be scary, but you're in good hands." Nia opened her mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but the man's grip on her shoulder tightened imperceptibly. She closed her mouth, her words dying in her throat. The woman gave them a polite nod before moving on, leaving Nia alone with her mounting fear. As the minutes ticked by, the man seemed to relax. He leaned back in his seat, scrolling through his phone, confident that he was in control. But Nia's resolve was hardening. She had to try again. She couldn't let him win. When the boarding announcement came, he stood, pulling her up with him. They joined the line of passengers filing onto the plane, the hum of engines growing louder as they approached the jet bridge. Nia's palms were sweaty, her breath coming in shallow bursts. This was it. If she couldn't find help now, it might be too late. The flight attendants greeted them at the door, their smiles bright but fleeting as they waved passengers through. Nia's gaze darted to the woman nearest her, a young attendant with curly hair pinned neatly under her hat. Nia wanted to reach out, to grab her hand, to plead for help, but the man's iron grip on her wrist held her back. They moved to their seats, the man settling into the aisle seat while Nia took the window. The narrow confines of the plane felt suffocating, the air heavy with recycled breaths and the faint smell of fuel. Nia's heart sank as she realized how trapped she truly was. The man leaned over, his voice low but firm. "We're almost there," he said. Don't mess this up." Nia clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't stay silent. She had to find a way to make someone listen. But with every passing moment, the walls seemed to close in tighter, and her hope grew dimmer. The plane's engines roared to life as the flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisle, checking seatbelts and instructing passengers to stow their belongings. Nia sat frozen in her window seat, her small hands gripping the armrests as she watched the airport lights blur past her window. Her heart pounded with every movement, every sound, her thoughts racing far faster than the aircraft preparing for takeoff. The man beside her, the one who called himself her father but clearly wasn't, leaned back in his seat with an air of ease. His phone was tucked away, his hands resting casually on his lap as if this were just another routine flight. But Nia saw the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers occasionally twitched, betraying his attempts to appear calm. He was in control, and he knew it, but he was also watchful, ready to act at the first sign of trouble. The flight attendant's voice broke through the noise, cheerful yet professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, and all carry-on items are securely stowed beneath the seat in front of you." Nia's gaze darted to the attendants as they moved past her row. One of them, a woman with neatly pinned curls and a badge that read "Chris," paused briefly to glance down the aisle. For a moment, their eyes met, and Nia felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Chris would notice her, see the fear she couldn't put into words. But the moment passed, and Chris moved on, checking the overhead bins with practiced efficiency. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Nia's stomach churned. The reality of her situation pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She was trapped. The man had made sure of that. His grip on her wrist earlier, the way he spoke for her at every turn, it was all designed to keep her silent, compliant. But she couldn't let it end like this. The plane lifted off the ground, and Nia's heart sank further. The airport, the bustling crowds, the potential for escape. It was all gone now, swallowed by the dark sky. She pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching the city lights shrink below her. She had never felt so far away from safety, from home. "Relax," the man said suddenly, breaking the silence between them. His voice was low, almost mocking. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Nia didn't respond. Her hands tightened into fists on her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She thought of her parents, of her father's warm laugh and her mother's reassuring hugs. She thought of how they would tell her to be brave, to never let fear silence her. The memory gave her a spark of strength, faint but steady. When the flight attendants began their service, rolling carts down the aisle with drinks and snacks, Nia saw her chance. She watched as Chris moved closer, her calm presence somehow grounding despite the turmoil in Nia's chest. The man beside her seemed distracted, his focus on his phone as he scrolled through messages. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Nia leaned slightly toward the aisle. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried all the urgency she felt. "Help me," she said, her words trembling but firm. "He's not my dad." Chris paused, her tray of drinks hovering midair as she looked down at Nia, her brows furrowed in confusion. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. What was that?" The man's head snapped up instantly, his sharp eyes locking on to Nia. "She's just nervous," he said smoothly, his tone dripping with feigned concern. "It's been a tough year for her, losing her mom and all. She gets confused sometimes." Nia's heart sank as she saw Chris hesitate, her gaze flicking between Nia and the man. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy with manipulation. "Is that true?" Chris asked gently, crouching slightly to be at eye level with Nia. "No," Nia blurted out, her voice rising despite the lump in her throat. "He's lying. He's not my dad. Please, you have to believe me." The man let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "She's had a hard time," he said, his voice tinged with false sympathy. "Sometimes she makes up stories. I'm sorry if she's bothering you." Chris straightened, her expression unreadable. "I see," she said carefully. She glanced at Nia again, her eyes softening slightly. "Let me know if you need anything, okay?" As Chris moved on, Nia felt a wave of despair crash over her. She wanted to shout, to scream that she was telling the truth. But the man's gaze bore into her like a warning. He leaned closer, his voice a low growl. "Don't try that again," he hissed. "You think they're going to take your word over mine? Just sit there and behave." Tears pricked at Nia's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She turned back to the window, her mind whirling. Chris hadn't believed her, or at least she hadn't acted like she did, but there had been something in her expression, a flicker of doubt. Maybe it wasn't over yet. As the flight went on, Nia noticed Chris glancing in her direction more often. The flight attendant's demeanor seemed calm, but there was a subtle tension in her movements, as if she was quietly observing. Nia clung to that hope, fragile but growing. Maybe Chris was beginning to see through the man's lies. When the plane hit a patch of turbulence, the man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Nia noticed his grip on the armrest, the way his jaw tightened. For the first time, he didn't seem entirely in control. She filed that away, her resolve hardening. He wasn't invincible. As the cabin lights dimmed for the night portion of the flight, Chris passed by again, her footsteps light against the carpeted floor. She paused briefly at Nia's row, her eyes meeting Nia's for the briefest moment. This time there was something different in her gaze, an unspoken promise. "Try to get some rest," Chris said softly, her words directed at both Nia and the man. "It's a long flight." Nia nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know what Chris was planning, but for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a sliver of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. As the plane soared through the dark sky, Nia closed her eyes, clutching that hope tightly. She didn't know how or when, but she knew she had to find a way to escape. And she was beginning to believe that she might not have to do it alone. The plane hummed softly as the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. The lights were dimmed now, casting a muted glow over the rows of seats. Nia sat stiffly in her window seat, her small frame pressed tightly against the wall of the aircraft. Her eyes flicked towards the aisle every time Chris walked by, her silent plea for help lingering in her mind. She couldn't let herself cry, not here, not now. She had to stay strong, even though every nerve in her body screamed at her to panic. Beside her, the man who wasn't her father reclined slightly, feigning relaxation. His eyes, however, betrayed his alertness. They darted occasionally to Chris as she moved up and down the aisle, offering refreshments or adjusting blankets for sleeping passengers. Nia noticed the faint tension in his posture, the way his hands rested too rigidly on the armrests. He was watching, too, and Nia knew it wasn't out of concern for her. Chris, meanwhile, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had worked hundreds of flights in her career and had seen her fair share of nervous travelers, agitated parents, and upset children. But this was different. The way the little girl had looked at her, wide-eyed and desperate, gnawed at her. And then there was the man. His calm demeanor seemed practiced, too perfect. Chris had seen that type of control before, often in people who had something to hide. She moved to the back galley, taking a moment to collect her thoughts. Her co-worker, Amelia, was busy arranging trays for the next service. "Everything okay?" Amelia asked, glancing at Chris as she leaned against the counter. Chris hesitated. "I'm not sure," she admitted, lowering her voice. "There's a man in 22C with a little girl, and something about them feels off." Amelia paused, turning her full attention to Chris. "What do you mean?" Chris explained the girl's whispered plea, the man's overly smooth explanations, and the subtle but telling way he seemed to control the situation. "I've seen nervous kids before," Chris said, "but this girl isn't just scared of flying. She's scared of him." Amelia frowned. "Do you think he's lying about being her father?" "I don't know," Chris admitted, "but if he is, we can't afford to ignore it." Amelia nodded slowly. "Do you want to tell the captain?" "Not yet," Chris said. "I don't have enough to go on, but I'm going to keep an eye on them. If I see anything else, I'll bring it up." With her mind made up, Chris returned to the cabin. She moved deliberately through the aisles, her practiced smile in place as she checked on passengers. When she reached Nia's row, she lingered for a moment longer than necessary, pretending to adjust a nearby overhead bin. "Everything all right here?" she asked casually. "Fine," the man replied smoothly, not even looking up from his phone. His tone was polite but dismissive, as if to discourage further conversation. Nia didn't say anything, her gaze fixed firmly on her lap. Chris felt a pang of frustration. She knew the girl was scared, but without more information her hands were tied. She couldn't accuse a man of kidnapping without proof, no matter how strong her gut feeling was. Still, Chris wasn't ready to let it go. She retreated to the galley and pulled out the passenger manifest. Scanning the names, she found the man's details. Eric Thornton, traveling with Nia Thornton. According to the documents, he was her father. But Chris knew how easy it was to forge such papers, especially if someone was determined enough. Her doubts only deepened as the flight continued. She noticed the way the man kept a close eye on Nia, how he intercepted her every movement. When Nia asked to go to the bathroom, he insisted on standing outside the door, waiting for her. When Chris offered the girl a drink, he answered for her, saying she didn't need anything. It was as if he couldn't let her speak for herself, not even for a moment. At one point, Chris deliberately dropped a napkin near their row, giving her an excuse to bend down and make brief eye contact with Nia. The girl's eyes were filled with silent urgency, her fear palpable. Chris straightened, her resolve hardening. She needed to act, but she had to be careful. If the man sensed that she was suspicious, he might become dangerous. She made her way back to the cockpit, knocking lightly on the door before entering. The captain and the first officer looked up, their expressions curious. "What's going on, Chris?" the captain asked. "There's a situation I think you need to know about," Chris began, keeping her voice calm but firm. She outlined her observations, describing the man's behavior and the girl's apparent fear. "I don't have concrete evidence," she admitted, "but my instincts are telling me something's wrong." The captain frowned, considering her words. "We can't accuse someone without proof," he said, "but we also can't ignore a potential safety concern. I'll notify ground control and request a discreet police presence when we land. In the meantime, keep observing and let me know if anything escalates." Chris nodded, feeling a mix of relief and lingering unease. She returned to the cabin, determined to gather as much information as she could. As the plane cruised through the night sky, she found small ways to interact with Nia, offering her a blanket, asking if she needed anything. Each time the man deflected her attempts, his control over the girl unyielding. But Chris wasn't the only one noticing. A few rows behind, an older woman had been watching the interaction. She leaned over to her husband, whispering, "That little girl doesn't look happy. Do you think something's wrong?" Her husband glanced at the row, his brow furrowing. "Maybe. Should we say something?" The woman hesitated. "Let's wait and see," she said. "That flight attendant seems to be paying attention. If something's wrong, I'm sure she'll do something." Unbeknownst to them, their quiet observations were adding to the growing unease in the cabin. Other passengers began to notice the tension, the strange dynamic between the man and the girl. Whispers spread, quiet but insistent, like the rustling of leaves before a storm. Chris felt the weight of their unspoken questions every time she walked down the aisle. She knew the cabin was watching, waiting for her to act, and as the minutes ticked by, she felt the urgency mounting. She had to make the right call for Nia's sake, and for everyone else on board. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin, an endless background drone that seemed to heighten the tension in the air. Chris walked the aisle slowly, her thoughts racing as she replayed every interaction she'd had with the man and the little girl. She was trained to remain calm under pressure, to trust her instincts without letting them cloud her judgment. But this situation felt different, more urgent, more precarious. The man in 22C was too composed, too controlling. Every time Chris tried to engage with the girl, his responses came a split second too quickly, as though he were guarding against a misstep. The girl, on the other hand, seemed to radiate fear. Her silence wasn't the bashful shyness of a child traveling with a parent. It was something heavier, something that made Chris's stomach churn. As she returned to the galley, Chris glanced discreetly toward 22C. The man was scrolling on his phone again, his shoulders relaxed in a way that felt calculated. The girl sat beside him, her small hands clenched tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the seat back in front of her. Chris felt a wave of frustration. She needed more than a gut feeling to act. Her colleague Amelia met her in the galley, concern etched across her face. "Anything new?" she asked quietly. Chris shook her head. "He's too careful. Every time I try to talk to her, he shuts it down. I think he's on to me." Amelia frowned, glancing toward the cabin. "Did you tell the captain?" "I did," Chris replied. "He's notified ground control. There'll be police waiting when we land. But I'm worried about what could happen before then." Amelia hesitated, then placed a reassuring hand on Chris's arm. "We've got your back," she said. "Whatever you need, just say the word." Chris nodded, grateful for the support. She knew the situation required careful handling. The man didn't seem overtly aggressive, but there was something dangerous about his calculated demeanor. If he realized they were on to him, he might escalate. As the plane hit a patch of turbulence, Chris felt a flicker of unease ripple through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, some gripping the armrests as the plane rocked gently. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, reassuring everyone that the turbulence was temporary. But Chris couldn't shake the feeling that the unease wasn't confined to the weather outside. She decided to approach the passengers seated near 22C, hoping to gauge their observations without drawing attention to herself. In the row behind the man and the girl, an older woman sat with her husband, their quiet conversation interrupted when Chris stopped beside them. "Everything all right here?" Chris asked, her tone light but probing. The woman glanced toward 22C before looking back at Chris. "Actually," she said, lowering her voice, "we were wondering about the little girl up there. She doesn't seem happy." Her husband nodded. "And the man with her, he's been keeping a pretty tight grip on things. Doesn't let her speak much." Chris felt a surge of validation. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "If you notice anything else, please don't hesitate to call me." She continued her quiet inquiries, speaking to passengers in nearby rows. Most had noticed the same things: the man's controlling behavior, the girl's nervous demeanor. One passenger even mentioned overhearing the girl whisper something about the man not being her father. With each conversation, Chris's resolve grew stronger. She wasn't imagining things. Something was wrong. Returning to the galley, Chris updated Amelia. "The passengers are noticing it too," she said. "We can't let him know we're on to him, but we need to be ready to act." Amelia nodded, her expression serious. "What's the plan?" Chris thought for a moment, then outlined her strategy. "We need to keep him calm and unaware. I'll make another pass through the cabin, acting like everything's normal. If he makes a move, or if the girl tries to signal again, we'll intervene. Otherwise, we wait until we land and let the police handle it." Amelia agreed, and the two women prepared for the final stretch of the flight. Chris felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. Every instinct told her she was doing the right thing, but the stakes felt impossibly high. If she was wrong, she risked accusing an innocent man. If she was right, and she failed to act in time, the consequences could be devastating. As the cabin settled back into an uneasy quiet, Chris made her way down the aisle again. She paused briefly at 22C, offering a polite smile. "Would you like anything to drink?" The man looked up from his phone, his expression neutral. "No, we're fine," he said. Chris nodded, her gaze shifting to the girl. "How about you, sweetheart?" The girl hesitated, her eyes flicking to the man before she shook her head. Chris's heart ached at the sight. The girl looked trapped, her fear almost tangible. "All right," Chris said gently. "Let me know if you need anything." As she moved on, Chris felt the man's eyes follow her, sharp and assessing. He knew something was happening, but he didn't know how much Chris had pieced together. It was a dangerous balance, one Chris knew she had to maintain until they landed. When the captain announced the descent, Chris returned to the galley to prepare for the landing. Amelia joined her, and they exchanged a look of mutual understanding. The next few minutes would be critical. "Police are confirmed," Amelia said. "They'll be waiting at the gate." Chris exhaled, her nerves taut but steady. She checked the manifest one last time, committing the details to memory. This man, Eric Thornton, was about to face scrutiny he clearly wasn't prepared for. And the little girl, Nia, would finally have a chance to speak the truth. As the plane descended towards the glowing city below, Chris felt a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't know what would happen when they landed, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let this man get away with whatever he was planning, not without a fight. The plane began its descent, and the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted. Passengers stirred in their seats, buckling seatbelts and stowing away loose items in preparation for landing. The once subdued hum of conversation grew louder, blending with the occasional creak of overhead compartments as people adjusted their bags. Amid the activity, Chris remained hyper-aware of the man in 22C and the girl by his side. The man, who had maintained a composed demeanor throughout the flight, seemed slightly tenser now. His hands rested firmly on the armrests, and he occasionally glanced at his phone as if waiting for some signal. The girl, on the other hand, sat frozen in her seat, her small shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself invisible. Chris's heart ached at the sight, but she kept her expression neutral, careful not to give anything away. As the plane drew closer to the ground, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all carry-on items are stowed securely. We'll be on the ground shortly." The announcement was routine, but for Chris it carried a weight of anticipation. She knew that waiting police officers would meet them at the gate, ready to intervene. Her job now was to keep the situation calm until then, to ensure that neither the man nor the girl was put at further risk. She made one final pass through the cabin, checking on passengers and collecting stray items. When she reached 22C, she paused, her gaze lingering on the girl. "Everything all right here?" she asked, her tone light but purposeful. The man smiled tightly. "We're fine," he said, his voice clipped. Chris nodded, but she didn't move immediately. She crouched slightly, bringing herself to the girl's eye level. "How about you, sweetheart?" she asked gently. "Do you need anything before we land?" The girl hesitated, her wide eyes flicking to the man before darting back to Chris. There was a moment of silence, thick with unspoken tension, before she shook her head slightly. Chris felt a pang of frustration, but she masked it with a reassuring smile. "All right," she said. "We'll be on the ground soon." As she stood, Chris noticed the man's jaw tighten. He was aware of her lingering attention, and it was clear he didn't like it. She continued down the aisle, her mind racing. The girl's fear was unmistakable, but the man's control over her was equally strong. Chris knew she had to tread carefully. Back in the galley, Chris met Amelia's gaze. "They're definitely on edge," she said in a low voice. "The girl looks terrified, and he knows we're watching." Amelia nodded, her expression grave. "Do you think he'll try anything?" "I don't know," Chris admitted, "but I'm ready if he does." As the plane touched down, a wave of relief washed over Chris. The ground beneath them felt like a promise of safety, a signal that help was close at hand. The cabin filled with the sound of passengers unbuckling their seatbelts and reaching for their belongings, eager to disembark. Chris moved quickly to the front of the plane, preparing for the critical moments ahead. The man in 22C didn't rush to gather his things. Instead, he remained seated, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Chris could see the tension in his posture, the way his fingers tapped lightly against his knee. He was waiting for something, and that made her nervous. The first officer stepped into the cabin, his expression calm but serious. He gave Chris a slight nod, confirming that the police were in position outside the plane. Chris took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. When the doors opened, Chris moved to the front of the aisle, her professional demeanor intact. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us today," she said, her voice steady. "We'll begin disembarking shortly, starting with the first rows. Please remain seated until it's your turn to exit." The passengers complied, the usual shuffling and murmuring filling the cabin. As the first rows began to empty, Chris kept a close eye on 22C. The man remained seated, his expression unreadable. The girl sat beside him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. When it was their turn to exit, the man stood, reaching for the girl's hand. She hesitated, her gaze darting toward Chris, who stood near the exit. The man noticed and tightened his grip. "Come on," he said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Chris stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Sir, could I speak with you for a moment before you disembark?" she asked, her voice firm but polite. The man froze, his expression hardening. "Why?" he asked, his tone defensive. Chris gestured subtly toward the galley. "Just a quick question about your connection," she said smoothly. "It won't take long." He hesitated, his eyes narrowing. Chris could see the calculation in his gaze, the way he weighed his options. Finally, he nodded. "Fine," he said, his grip still firm on the girl's hand. As he followed Chris to the galley, the police entered the plane, their presence quiet but authoritative. The man's eyes widened slightly when he saw them, his composure cracking for the first time. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice rising. One of the officers stepped forward, his expression calm but unyielding. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions," he said. "Please remain calm and cooperate." The man's grip on the girl tightened, and for a moment, Chris feared he might try to bolt. But the officers moved quickly, surrounding him and gently but firmly separating him from the girl. "Let go of me!" he shouted, his voice filled with anger. The girl stumbled back, her wide eyes brimming with tears as Chris caught her. "You're okay," Chris whispered, holding her close. "You're safe now." The man continued to protest, but the officers remained calm, their voices steady as they explained the situation. They escorted him off the plane, leaving the cabin in stunned silence. Passengers whispered among themselves, their curiosity and concern palpable. Chris turned her attention to the girl, crouching down to meet her gaze. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked gently. The girl nodded, her lower lip trembling. "He's not my dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know," Chris said softly, "and we're going to make sure you get home to your real family." As the officers led the man away in handcuffs, Chris felt a wave of relief. The danger was over, but she knew the journey for the little girl was far from finished. She would need time to heal, to process what had happened. But at least now, she had a chance. As the girl clung to Chris's hand, Chris made a silent promise to herself. She would do everything in her power to ensure the girl found her way back to safety, and to the people who loved her. The air was crisp and cool as Chris stepped off the plane, her hand gently resting on the shoulder of the young girl by her side. Nia clung to her tightly, her small fingers gripping the fabric of Chris's uniform. The terminal was quieter now, most of the passengers having already dispersed into the busy airport. Ahead, a small group of police officers and airport security personnel waited near the gate, their postures alert but non-threatening. Beyond them, Chris caught a glimpse of a man and a woman rushing toward the restricted area, their faces etched with fear and desperation. "Naya," Chris said softly, crouching to meet the girl's gaze, "I think your parents are here." The girl's wide eyes darted toward the figures in the distance, and for a moment her expression wavered. Then recognition dawned, and her lips parted in a shaky gasp. "Mommy? Daddy?" Before Chris could say another word, Nia broke into a run, her small legs carrying her toward the barrier where her parents stood. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, knelt down just in time to catch her as she flung herself into his arms. The woman joined them a second later, wrapping both of them in a tight embrace. Tears streamed down her face as she kissed Nia's forehead, her hands cradling the girl as though she might disappear. Chris watched the scene unfold, a lump rising in her throat. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered relief and love, a stark contrast to the fear and tension that had gripped the last several hours. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before approaching the family. As she neared them, the father looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for bringing her back to us." The mother nodded, her hands never leaving Nia's shoulders. We were so scared. We didn't know if we'd ever see her again." Chris shook her head, her own voice thick with emotion. "Your daughter's incredible," she said. "She's the bravest little girl I've ever met. She found a way to speak up, even when it was terrifying. She saved herself." Nia's mother hugged her daughter tighter, pressing her face into Nia's hair. "You're our hero, sweetheart," she whispered. One of the police officers stepped forward, his demeanor professional but kind. "Mr. and Mrs. Evans, we'll need to take your statements and conduct a brief interview with Nia to ensure we have all the details. After that, you'll be free to take her home." The father nodded, his expression resolute. "Of course, whatever you need." As the family was escorted to a nearby office, Chris lingered in the terminal, her thoughts racing. The events of the day replayed in her mind. The man's cold confidence, Nia's quiet desperation, the moment when everything had finally clicked into place. She felt a mix of pride and unease, knowing how close things had come to ending differently. Amelia approached her, a tired but relieved smile on her face. "You did good, Chris," she said. "Really good." Chris nodded slowly. I couldn't ignore it. Something about her eyes, the way she looked at me. It was like she was screaming for help without saying a word." Amelia placed a hand on Chris's shoulder. "You listened when it mattered. That's more than most people would have done." The two flight attendants stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling over them. Then Chris straightened, brushing a stray curl from her face. "I think I'll check on them," she said. "Make sure Nia's okay before I head out." Amelia nodded. "Go. I'll wrap things up here." Chris found the Evans family in the small office, where a child specialist was gently speaking with Nia. The girl's parents watched from a short distance, their worry evident even as they tried to stay calm. When Chris entered, the mother immediately came to her, wrapping her in a tight hug. "You don't know what this means to us," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved our baby." Chris shook her head. "She saved herself," she said again. "I just helped her get the chance to do it." The father extended his hand, and Chris shook it firmly. "If there's anything we can ever do to repay you," he began, but Chris cut him off gently. "There's nothing to repay," she said. "Just take her home and love her. That's all that matters." The conversation shifted to practicalities as the police shared updates on the man who had posed as Nia's father. His real name, they explained, was Eric Mason, and he was part of an organized network specializing in child abductions. The group targeted vulnerable children, using forged documents and manipulative tactics to pass unnoticed. Mason had been apprehended thanks to Chris's intervention, and investigators were hopeful that his arrest would lead to dismantling the larger operation. Hearing this, Chris felt a chill run through her. The scale of the danger Nia had faced was staggering, but it also reinforced the importance of what they had done. By stopping Mason, they had not only saved Nia, but potentially prevented countless other tragedies. As the family prepared to leave, Nia turned to Chris, her small hand reaching out. "Will I see you again?" she asked, her voice soft. Chris crouched down to her level, smiling warmly. "Maybe," she said, "but even if you don't, you'll always have this to remember. You're brave, Nia. Braver than most grown-ups I know. Never forget that." Nia nodded solemnly, her grip tightening on Chris's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Chris watched as the family walked away, their figures growing smaller as they moved toward the terminal exit. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that they were heading home together, stronger for what they had endured. As Chris finally left the terminal and stepped into the cool night air, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. The job wasn't always easy, and it often went unnoticed, but today had been different. Today, she had made a difference, and that, she thought, was more than enough. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories and updates, and hit the bell so you never miss a new upload. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with your friends and family to keep the conversation going. Also, check out our other videos. We've got more stories waiting for you. See you next time.